Welcome, everybody. We are going to give you just a few minutes for everyone to get on. Right. Looks like people are slowly trickling in. So we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody, to the webinar today on collaborating for justice for older African Americans. We're excited to have this webinar today. This is the first of a three-part series we're offering to share more on the importance of engaging culturally specific programs in multidisciplinary elder justice responses. Here at NCAL, the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, we recently released a new resource to support mainstream organizations and elder justice teams. This guide, called Collaborating for Justice, is what we'll talk about today. So in this webinar series, we're going to cover more about this resource and how it can be used to support your work. So today's webinar will focus on setting the foundation for the importance of culturally specific programs and organizations in serving the African American community. So we thank our partners at the U.S. Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime for the funding that made this project possible. And we'd like to note that the content of the webinar is that of NCALS and not necessarily DOJ OVC. I am very pleased to be joined today with two presenters. I'll start with introducing myself first. My name is Kristen Berkey, and I'm the director of the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, or NCAL. Victoria?
Hi, everyone. I'm Victoria Ferguson Young. I am the Victim Services Coordinator at NCAL, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. I'm Latrice Buck. I am from Inspire Consulting, and I'm a consultant for NCAL. So happy to be here today.
All right. So for those who are joining us who might not be familiar with NCAL's work, we are a national project out of End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin, which is Wisconsin's domestic violence coalition. Our focus is really on providing support to communities and professionals across the country as they seek to improve services to older adults impacted by abuse, neglect, and exploitation. So this includes training, we provide consultation and technical assistance, and we develop resources such as Collaborating for Justice. Ultimately, everyone here at NCAL believes that all of us deserve to age with safety and dignity, and this takes communities working together. So what we're hoping for you to get out of the webinar today is, first, we want you to understand what is the Collaborating for Justice Guide, what does it entail, what is its purpose, how can it support you? And then we want you to leave knowing a little bit more about what are culturally specific programs, and then why are they so important for the African American community. And then third, we want you to leave understanding that importance and how the historical, political, and social context, including racialized trauma, makes culturally specific programs so important. So I want to first make sure that folks understand what we're talking about when we refer to abuse in later life, and why it's so important to address it. For many reasons, including ageism and other intersecting forms of bias and discrimination, older adults are often overlooked as they experience in services and responses to abuse in later life. There exists a social norm of devaluing people as they age, and this puts older adults at risk for abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And it also allows for abuse experienced by older adults to not be recognized, and for older adults to have less access to the support and services they need. It's becoming increasingly important for us to be talking about abuse in later life because of the aging of our country's population. This year, 2024, marks the beginning of the largest surge of retirement age Americans turning 65 in our nation's history. So we always talked about how 10,000 Americans turn 65 every day. And as very recently, that changed to 11,200 Americans turn 65 every day. And over half of the population age 65 are women. In just 10 years, older adults will outnumber children for the first time in US history. So in short, this is one of the most significant demographic trends of our time. And this is also an increasingly diverse population as it relates to race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, and other dimensions of diversity. And this just creates a greater urgency for abuse in later life responses to account for an older adult's background, culture, and identity. So you've heard me refer to abuse in later life. What exactly is this? Abuse in later life is a segment of elder abuse that focuses on domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking of adults age 50 and up. Abuse in later life intentionally focuses on the intersection of domestic and sexual violence with elder abuse. And this occurs intentionally because domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking cuts across all demographic groups, occurs across the lifespan. Yet often victim services focus on younger adults, and elder abuse interventions don't always account for the domestic violence and sexual assault context. So this kind of creates a gap in fields where abuse experienced by older adults isn't recognized, and older survivors are often unable to access the support and services they need. So let's just break down abuse in later life briefly, just so we have some foundational understanding. Regarding age, we talk about abuse in later life starting at age 50. And while many people don't think of age 50 as later life, inclusion of this in our definition is intentional. That's because people experiencing abuse between around age 50 to 61 may have unique barriers. They might not be eligible for programs for families who have dependent children, but then they might not be old enough to utilize programs for older adults like Social Security or Medicare or programs through the Aging Services Network. Additionally, 50 and older is more inclusive for populations of victims who maybe because of poverty, lack of healthcare, historical trauma, have a shorter life expectancy than others. So when we talk about this second bullet, who are perpetrators in this definition of abuse in later life, we're talking about individuals who have an ongoing relationship with an older victim, a relationship where there's an expectation of trust. So these relationships include intimate partners, spouses, adult children, other family members, caregivers, and others in a position of trust. This relationship makes it easier for perpetrators to manipulate and control the victim. And what types of abuse? Abuse in later life includes physical, sexual, emotional abuse, as well as financial exploitation. And then, of course, it's so important to know that, as with younger victims, it's not uncommon for different types of abuse to co-occur. So, for example, if someone is experiencing neglect, it's very likely that they might, for example, be experiencing financial exploitation. And then abuse can happen anywhere in private dwellings in the community and facilities. And we emphasize that because oftentimes people think of elder abuse and they automatically go to nursing homes. And this is not the case. So as we seek to serve older survivors, it's important to understand the importance of identity. Often when we think of an older adult, the default goes to thinking that age is the most salient identity, that it's the most important one, but it's only one of many identities. Some, like race, culture, class, are identities that we're born into. Others are those that we choose. And then many, like age or ability status, may change over time. And the reason that we talk about this, and it's so important to be aware of, is that each of our identities influences how we experience the world, how we connect to others, and then how others perceive us. and how others respond to us. So when we planned for the Collaborating for Justice project, this understanding of the importance of identity was really at the very foundation. We know that in this case, the identity of being older and being African American is unique, and older African Americans deserve that the services they receive, should they experience abuse, recognizes that. So I'll talk a little bit about what the purpose of this is, and then pass it over to Dr. Buck to talk about some foundational work that NCAL did. So the Collaborating for Justice Guide really ultimately has the goal to improve services for older African American survivors. So this is done through highlighting the prevalence of historical and present day racial trauma for African Americans, really emphasizing the importance of culturally specific programs, and then amplifying the needs of mainstream organizations to engage in equitable partnerships. So this guide was designed to provide practical, relevant, and clear strategies to develop and cultivate these important partnerships. And I'd like to note that the guide builds upon the previously released Increasing Access to Healing Services and Just Outcomes toolkit that Dr. Buck was part of. And then we'll discuss that. She'll discuss that toolkit and provide some brief history of that initiative to improve services to older African Americans.
So let's get into talking about this. This was something that we really were excited about, a project, because for years in the other national clearinghouse for abuse in later life, grantees, when we were doing law enforcement training and we were doing advocate training and advanced law enforcement training, even the prosecutors training, what we found is that many people would ask questions constantly about, what is it that we need to do to work with older African American participants, and how can we be effective? So many of them didn't really have a lot of curriculum or tools, or even individuals within their community could guide them in this conversation. So in 2020, we developed this toolkit around that need and those needs. We embarked on engaging national advocates, individuals that were in the field that were doing effective practice and service prevention and victim services around this issue. And we had this guided conversation through during at the end of COVID. And we came up with a lot of things that related to how to effectively not only help, but engage African American older adults in system provision, and how to have real conversations with them. This is a three-part toolkit. It comes with a resource guide. There are video clips, and then there's a book for reflections that discusses, once we talk about the content, you have the ability to go back through and reflect on things that were said and how you can engage African American elders in victim services. So it has these 5 modules, and the effective thing about it is, in these modules, there's a lot of content, and there are there's terminology that individuals may not be familiar with. So we provided this glossary. That was one of our things. I know so often in our field, we use a lot of jargon, we use a lot of, acronyms, we use a lot of things that some people aren't familiar with. And then some of the content was based on things that were real for African American elders and the way that they discuss their experience. And then we have an appendix. So the guide in these modules, module 1 talks about oppression and trauma in the lives of older African Americans. Module 2 talks about the intersection when we're looking at crime victim experience, healing, and justice. And then we go into 3 with the intersectional look at the historical trauma, crime victimization in African American family. And then 4 is the intersectional look at intergenerational trauma, crime victimization in African American families. And then 5 ends with enhancing strategies for service and informing transformative action which we're discussing today truly builds on. It was significant for the videos that we had of the older African American participants that are survivors in this, that they engaged in not only just the conversation and things that we were covering, but that they elaborated on what was important to them. And we built the content around that. So in this reflections book that we have, it's about the content in every module. There are questions that are asked during that time, and you can go on. Now, during the toolkit, in the videos, you will see that we presented this over like within a 6 months period in different parts of the United States, engage in different audiences to see what would be effective, and a utilization of all of the videos. There are many. I want to give credit to Asha Family Services in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the Waukesha Women's Center in Waukesha, Wisconsin, for allowing us to utilize their space to create these videos. And so also in that workbook are the glossary terms, and there's also a fillable, printable version of it. One of the things I think that is so significant are the 3 survivor stories. And I always say, even if the content is there, the stories tell, everything you need to know, really. And also the expert panel discussion, which I was a part of. And we discussed Antonia Drew from Milwaukee, Brother Muhammad from Milwaukee, she's from New Jersey, and really talked about what it's like to increase that access for older African American crime survivors and to understand their reality, to provide the services that are going to be helpful, healing, and safe.
Thanks, Latrice. We wanted to share about that because, as she said, it is such a foundational piece for the Collaborating for Justice project, because the Collaborating for Justice project really builds on the understanding of the importance of the historical, political, cultural context and how elder justice partners serve older African American survivors. So this guide, Collaborating for Justice, is really geared toward elder justice teams and those who are working to serve older survivors. So NCAL works with coordination teams across the country that are advancing elder justice. Those might be a CCR, Coordinated Community Response. It might be a multidisciplinary team. And the common struggle that we hear is that they really struggle to have their team reflect the community. And within this project, we wanted to learn, why is that? What are the perspectives of culturally specific programs? What are the perspectives of the mainstream organizations? What are the barriers to collaboration? What works, what doesn't work? And this is really important because elder abuse is complex and it really takes a multidisciplinary response. And not having a key partner like culturally specific programs that can really reflect the needs of the community is really a problem. So in 2002, NCAL and the Asha Project and our consultants, including Dr. Buck and Umi Hankins, who held several interviews, roundtables, and listening sessions. We talked to representatives of culturally specific programs across the country and mainstream organization leaders. And we really wanted to hear about their experience with collaboration. When someone sends you an email to come join their team, what does that feel like? What works, what doesn't? What makes you want to join? What makes you doesn't? Makes you not want to join? Really, what is the experience of trying to build these relationships? The topics that we explored in the interviews and listening sessions were, what's the impact of culturally specific programs? What's the status of current collaboration? What gets in the way of collaboration? And then what would equitable collaboration look like? So resulting from that, all of those conversations is the Collaborating for Justice Guide, and it includes 3 parts. The first is a report, and then a conversation guide, and then a community forum toolkit. So component one is the report, and this really reflects the experiences of culturally specific programs and mainstream elder justice partners. The topics covered include, why do culturally specific programs exist? So what gap do they fill? Why are they so important in the African American community? And then it discussed the importance of elder justice teams to collaborate with these programs. We also know that there are barriers to that collaboration. So the guide outlines some of those barriers and then discussed what effective collaboration entails. We ultimately really wanted this to be very practical. We wanted for people to look at this and walk away with having ideas that they could actually put on their to-do list that would really support them in finding culturally specific programs in their community, and then start building those relationships in ways that really are equitable, respectful, and effective. The component two is a conversation guide. And this provides direction on internal conversations for organizations or internal conversations within an elder justice team. So it's important for these teams and organizations to first discuss internally the importance of improving services to older African American survivors. Prior to the outreach efforts, you want the team to be ready. You want people to be ready for building these equitable relationships and really kind of be bought into why they're important. So the conversation guide supports courageous conversations about any fears, reservations, or challenges, and then discusses the benefits, importance, and impact. So within this guide, there are 4 discussion prompts to begin a conversation on the importance of intentionally supporting older African American adults, exploring fears and concerns about equitable engagement with culturally specific programs. Or 3 is organizational preparation for equitable engagement. And then the 4th prompt is on creating the space to engage in difficult conversations about race, power, and collaboration. In addition to the discussion prompts, the conversation guide includes resources to help you in facilitating this conversation, which is designed to be ongoing, as well as facilitation guidelines. You'll hear more about this in next week at our webinar, but that's a little bit of a summary. And then the third component is a community forum toolkit. We heard during our listening sessions loud and clear and repeatedly that one of the barriers to collaborations is that so many community partners work in silos. There's a lot of good reasons for this. There's how busy everyone is, the grant funding, maybe not having a shared vision, all sorts of reasons. So, but the problem with that is that it results in people not always knowing what's happening. And in this case, not knowing what's happening to support the African American community. So to address this, a community forum toolkit is aimed at equipping multidisciplinary teams with resources to bring together partners working with and on behalf of older African Americans to really develop a shared understanding of the community efforts already occurring. And then what are opportunities to further advance elder justice for the African American community? So we'll talk about this more in more detail next week as well, so that you can learn how the community forum toolkit could be used. So I'll pass it back to Dr. Buck. She's going to talk more about what we learned in this project, and then starting with what are culturally specific programs.
All right, so in this section, we're going to spend a little time explaining the need and purpose of culturally specific organizations. So African American culturally specific programs may focus on a variety of issues that we've found, such as domestic violence and sexual violence, health, equity, housing, mental health. They may focus on community food share, on house individuals. There may be many programs and faith-based as well that are in the community. So they may not be specific, stating that they only do domestic violence and sexual violence. And examples of this within Milwaukee County would be the Asha Project. And then there's the Infinity Community Service Program that's in Chicago, and Sasha Center in Detroit, to name a few. Would be programs that would be culturally specific. We always say for and by. These programs are designed for African Americans, they're designed by, and they're led by. That's a culturally specific agency, and that's truly the difference. And the individuals majority are being served, they're represented in their communities, and they're being served by individuals that are African American representing that population. And it affects in their program and how they provide service, where they're located, their values and norms, all rooted in the significance of specific programming to the African American community. So let's talk a little bit about the cultural context. So again, operating from the stance of for us, by us, in agencies, in areas where African American older adults are housed, where they commune, where they find community. So culturally specific organizations operate out of the context, of course, of community and the community that they serve. And that's what's specific. They're operating from a text of this is where our community is, and these are the services that are needed within that community. So it's important to bring your attention to the importance of the cultural context, which speaks to culture, the identity, and the experience of older African American adults living in the United States, which is very significant. Their experience is what the focus should be, not on what we think, but what is the lens of their experience. So a deeper understanding of cultural context can provide clarity and understanding around the approach and the impact of traditional victim services. That's significant. For so long, African Americans, older African Americans, are receiving services, and they're from mainstream agencies that are built around a context that has nothing to do with their experience and really doesn't have anything much to do with their community. Although they are serving and doing well, there still has to be a focus on the cultural context of the African American older adult. So we need to make sure that these services are impacted by beyond just what traditions are. It's critical that we know that there's value in their experience. We need to make sure we consider this and factor this into the work that we're doing with African American communities, especially with older adults. So when we talk about the social, political, and economic context, services and the community response will only be valuable. I want to say that again, will only be valuable and effective if they understand the realities of older African American adults, and that this social and political economic conditions and situations that have occurred in history, and for some of them that are present day victimization that continues to happen within the African American community for older adults. So let's talk a little bit about this. So this historical present day racialized oppression is significant for us all to understand, and the subsequent trauma that resulted in the marginalization of African American communities across the United States. So this country's long and devastating history that most of us are aware of racism and discrimination is deeply impacted the African Americans over a course of their lifespan, from slavery and Jim Crow racial segregation laws to redlining policies and the devisement of African American neighborhoods to policing and subsequently, we know, mass incarceration of African American men is a real thing around our historical context. Institutions and systems that are aimed to rob African American communities of their humanity and determine their success. What's significant is these racial harms are not just historical. We know that there's a historical portion of it, but we know that these still persist today in large and small ways throughout the communities, throughout the United States, and the way that public policies and institutions are reflected, how the repeated history of this constant systematic perpetuating system that's unfair to the advantages, unfair advantages of white people and the disadvantages of African Americans, indigenous, and other people of color within our communities. These policies have resulted in disparities and inequities across many dimensions of the African American community, through education, through employment, through housing, through health, through politics, and is persisting across generations in the lives of older African Americans. these policies are one of the reasons why. These issues that I just discussed is one of the reasons why that sometimes older African Americans will not decide to receive services and find it hard to trust the system. And I always tell people when they talk about the system, they're really talking about us, all of us that provide services, and how they trust. Will we respect them? Will we understand them? And will we keep them safe? And will we understand these inequities within the African American community? So racial and cultural trauma. So additionally, let's talk about it, because we need to be aware of this racial and this cultural trauma that's not directly acts of violence all the time, but they're direct acts of violence and discrimination, but also vicarious experience of microaggressions. I know a lot of times we hear people that'll say, yeah, microaggressions, but I want to tell you, when you've experienced that, and you've had to code switch through your life, there's a trauma in when you have to be a different person in different settings for different people in order for you to be safe. Who will know that more than an older African American individual that has gone through life trying to remain safe while they're still just being Black? Vicarious experience refers to witnessing racial and cultural violence directed at individuals in their communities, or constantly hearing about the experience of others. Where are they hearing it about? On social media, and you can't get past that it's heard every day on news outlets, no matter where you turn to within your streaming or whether other services that you have. And they're constantly faced with what African Americans are going through and continue to go through. Not just a historical sense of what they've gone through, what they're doing in present day. So these microaggressions are verbal and nonverbal aggressions. Many of them have had to deal with that over the years, through maybe their job situations, through their ability to receive services, where they receive services, where they are located in different communities, and basically how they matriculate through the spaces that they're in. These experiences are, not just through media, but they're in public places. And as we visit grocery stores or doctor's offices, or even any type of community programming that is not directly related to the community that they serve, anytime they're outside of their community, are dealing with things that they don't deal with inside of their community. So when we talk about this historical and present day racial trauma, we have to remember that it's important to note that trauma from racism on this continent dates back to 1619, when enslaved Africans were brought from North America, and it continued until the Emancipation Proclamation that was issued in 1863. Relevant. After 244 years of legal slavery, things that did not change incredibly overnight for African American people are will. Yes, they were emancipated. Did everything change? No. We have to remember there were some individuals that didn't even know they were free when this occurred. And so even in that, the systematic racism continues with these failed Reconstruction initiatives and these harsh Jim Crow laws that have happened, and sharecropping took slavery place and kept African Americans in bondage, unable to really achieve an economic freedom and growth. And I always say during this time, our great-grandfather was a sharecropper. My grandmother was a sharecropper and ran away from Mississippi to Jackson, and then relocated with her husband to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Born, and I'm just the fourth generation outside of it. And that's real. So it's good to know that some of us think of, oh, these are historical things. No, but when we're dealing with older African Americans, their history is their reality, and their present day continues to go on. And so these grave injustices, from domestic terrorism, rose from attacks with the Ku Klux Klans, lynching, Bloody Sunday in Selma, and more. And we know that continues. We know that Ku Klux Klan still continues to march, and there are things that still can happen within communities in the United States that's not safe, it's not fair, and it's unjust. So in 1960, there was a tremendous amount of social change, as we know, and several pieces of legislation were successfully passed to improve some of the livelihoods of African Americans. So that's just discussing the Civil Rights Bill, the Voting Rights Act, and in 1955, Brown versus DeBoer. And we know right now, many of them are having historical trauma, and they are having what we call current trauma, in the sense that they're being triggered by some of these things that are being removed, or people who are trying to remove them in present day. So all those civil rights legislation, let's get that. together. Although it has made a significant impact, and I don't want to say that it has not, there are still many ways that systematic racism permeates in our society. And we know that in every day by the things that we see all over the place. And social media is just a direct reflection of the things that continue to go on. There are just a few examples of the way racism shows up in our country. And it's important, again, about cultural context when serving older African American adults. What they have gone through and their ability to trust is significant. Our continued trauma and the impacts and the views of individuals is significant. And we know when we talk about racism and white supremacy, that it is real, and it's very real for those individuals that lived it. So has anyone ever seen this picture before? How many of you have seen this image of Ruby Bridges? Yeah, many of us had these in our textbooks coming up, and we saw this picture. And as a young woman, I can even say, without my parents, I wouldn't really even understood the relevance of it. So it's a snapshot at that time of 6-year-old Ruby Bridges, who she lived in New Orleans, and many of us know. And this was her first day at school. And they were segregating the schools during that, these white-only schools that were located in her neighborhood. And Ruby was surrounded, as you can see, by U.S. Marshals for her protection because of the threats by white protesters against her life and her family's life. This was definitely a turbulent time, and we have many historical images that can tell a story that sometimes people try to silence in our nation's history. So many people were killed and beaten for the fight, lost their lives, they lost their family lives, their homes and properties during that time, just trying to find a way to be free. So right now we have another picture. This is, so she was born in 1954. So many of us will see the Ruby Bridges in the work that we do, right? During that time, as we call that baby boomer age that's occurring, there she is right now in this picture. She's someone that is eligible for our services currently in later life services. And we have to keep in mind that we may have to consider the history, not just the Ruby Bridges, but how everyone who was during that time survived those things, and at that time didn't feel like anyone could help them. So many older adults who are receiving services from our agencies have experienced some sort of trauma, some real historical and present day trauma. And in their lifetimes, whether recent, or early experience, we have to what? Respect someone's experience. We have to expect older African American experience and how they receive us and how they receive victim services then and now. So let's talk a little bit as we do a group discussion, shall we? As we've gone through a lot of content. So what would you say, what is the impact of this context on older African American victims you work with? The things that we've just discussed, the historical issues that occur, present day issues that are happening, how they receive services, when and from whom they receive services. So what is the impact of this context on older African American victims you work with? And you have the ability, if you raise your hand, and you can be unmuted, or you can put your comments in the chat and we will read from there. So that's okay. Everyone's a little quiet now. It's all right.
I
Go
see
ahead.
that Julie Trim raised her hand.
Okay. Julie.
Victoria, I think, is gonna
Yep.
unmute her.
There we go. Okay. There you go. You should be able to speak now,
Okay.
Julie.
The chat says it's disabled, so we can't enter anything in it, but I'd like to say, as a white individual, when I go into a home of an individual that is not white, there is a lack of trust, which I acknowledge and don't take any offense to that. I know I will have to work to earn the trust of the individual. And hopefully I can be successful at that so that I can be helpful as an adult protection worker.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Julie, for allowing them to have that experience, right? And getting to know them. I think a lot of times we think just because we provide services that people just assume that we are safe. So thank you for that. Anyone else?
Naquanda Tucker, I'm gonna ask her to unmute as well, so she can come off mute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. Hello, Naquanda.
Hi. In regards to just the information that like was shared, I think even as an African American, I see it both times in dealing with my clients. Sometimes it's the fact that I'm younger than them, and so they automatically assume I don't know what I'm doing or what I'm talking about and can't relate. And then the other part of that is they're very just untrusting, generally speaking. So like I've even just seen it to where like you can walk into the home or walk into the visit and actually see like the home, like still attempt to minimize it. Because we do home visits. And so it's like, oh well no, sometimes he yells, but it's my fault. And it's like, well, yeah, it's still, but he still shouldn't be saying that. Can we just address that and normalize that, please? And then it's just, the dismissive, and it really is just eye-opening that in 2024 we still have that same mindset of like what happens in this house stays in this house, because once he leaves the house, it's outside of our control. And it's like just having to build that rapport consistently and from the beginning, just explain this is here to harm you or cause harm. I am just here to help and add resources. So it's just always good just to be mindful that there's a lot of just those external and internal factors that go into just people not feeling supported.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The rapport building is the main thing I want to discuss is with that. A significant rapport building and how individuals feel. I would say just because you're African American, no matter what age you're in, there's still a piece with them of trust, because we still represent a system. Although we may look like them, we are coming from a system. And so a lot of the ideologies and a lot of the theories that are present in the establishment of victim services was from a white context. And so we have to be aware of that, and so they're already thinking that we're putting services, that we're the services that we're providing are services that weren't made for them. So it's significant to think about what is needed, and the significance of that. Okay, so let's go a little bit into anyone else before we begin to move on. Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit about on our next slide, just the discussion points. We have to understand the significant impacts is that, there was expending unnecessary emotional labor, energy just to receive support after a victimization, how much they went through just to get help because they were African American, or their community didn't have certain services, or they weren't allotted to speak for themselves, or not in a space where they felt safe to speak for themselves, turned down, turned away, disregarded, isolated, demoralized in many sense, and how that affected them over time. And just that life or death for the survivors and their family, and we're not having any real holistic supports around them, and just having to deal with what was presented, when many times we know family is everything. And so older African Americans are considering that, the life or death factor also has a lot to do with that whole history of healing and what needs to heal. Holistic supports includes their faith, their communities, where they come from, what it is they believe, and how they've survived throughout the years, right? And then they have never really been, a part of the whole decision-making process, haven't been at the tables for many of the institutions that were formed and created, as we know, for their self, for the justice process, or even for their family members feeling excluded and not feeling like their voice is valuable, being more than unheard, but disrespected in their experience. And knowing that there were many cases that were unreported for many different reasons, right? The whole "what's here stays here," but may have been unreported because the individuals that showed up to their house didn't deem it important to report. And that older African adults may be hesitant always to seek help, and we can't take that personally out of our age, out of our culture, out of our race. It's around their experience and understanding when you're creating spaces for them, creating spaces with know that they come with trauma. And we want to end a little bit and talk about something called critical framework. So we can get an understanding as we close this section out. And I pass this on after I'm finished to Kristen. And so as we close this section, we want to bring your attention to service provision practices. And we want to talk about these practices that promote healing and those that promote marginalization. First, let's discuss the healing practice of this critical framework. Due to our cultural context that I discussed before, the lived experience of older African American adults utilizing this critical framework, which is also discussed in the toolkit that I talked about earlier, is significant. When we're conscious of each of these things on here: cultural humility, responsiveness, intersectional lens, trauma-informed, institutional positionality, centering, affirming, and learning and unlearning. When we're aware of these, we increase the chance of providing service that are healing and restorative. Not just providing services that create safe spaces, but spaces that create healing and restoration for individuals. So these healing practices of this critical framework, so cultural context and the life experiences, we need to utilize this. It's paramount that we consider all aspects of the older African American and where they're from, and understand that we have to be willingly conscious of this to provide victim services that are going to be impactful, healing, and restorative. So when we discuss mainstream practices, if you will, we've said mainstream quite a bit. And most people talk about what is mainstream and what does that mean. And so we know in our next slide that these mainstream practices that marginalized African American survivors are just significant in that. Thank you. So these things further marginalize African American adults. Let me talk about that. So this slide basically reflects the practices that continue. And I always say from mainstream agencies, the larger agencies that usually have a theory and a philosophy that was not designed for African Americans. And so these are individuals, when we talk about mainstream, around funding, around community, around access to services and things such as that. We have to be aware that one size does not fit all. No matter what approach that we use, although it may be with the best intent, that there are other ways that we can engage the African American older adults experience in practices. So we need to design programs that and not think that they're the same for everyone, okay? It's significant. They don't account for ways that the culture or history impacts the process of seeking healing, having healing, and all the cultural nuances that are risk and are really a protective factor, and they're unique in the way not only they receive services, but that they heal from the services that are being provided. This lack of racial literacy is significant. They don't understand the history that I discussed earlier, the history of racism and how that impacts African American outcomes and the experience today. Collaboration, lack of understanding of how funding prioritizes mainstream and majority white communities and programs, leaving African Americans at a disadvantage because of funding, access, and impact. Additionally, mainstream providers, they shy away from having these discussions around race and racism. Soon as individuals start talking about that and how their life has been impacted, people want to shy away and want to go to, I'm doing the best I can, I'm providing services, and I really care. And you may care, but when we care, we put the other voices at the table and we ask them questions about what it is they need instead of what it is that we want to provide. Many other thing that we need to be aware of also is that we need to know that they're going to be reluctant in these services and seeking services. And it is necessary for mainstream providers to not only make improvements, but the improvements that are needed to make sure they can reach older African American survivors. And then the discrimination and not understanding trauma responses and misunderstanding how African Americans respond to abuse and trauma. And this whole re-traumatization that survivors do not have, leaving them not only misunderstood, but judged about the way they see their family, the way they respond to their families, understanding that families are everything, and that they truly, truly believe that their children and their children and their nieces and nephews and their grandchildren are wealth. And the thought of having to turn one of them in or to involve the criminal justice system is something that they do not want to do because of the protection of my wealth, which is family. And then this rigid focus on victimization does not occur outside the context of the family. We need to make sure that we're doing this true holistic view, that we are really impacting and understand that this individual is a part of this grand scheme, this holistic piece of individuals that surround them, and not just care, but in who they care for, who cares for them, where they live, who they live with, you know, the places and that they frequent, and the individuals that are a part of their day-to-day life. We have to understand that this holistic care, this holistic healing, this restoration has to come with the sense of how do they believe that they need services. And so we need to know that this is particular where we're causing harm to the partner, like an adult child, as I stated before. Many times we have to understand that harm could be occurring, but it's occurring from someone that they love. They want the abuse to stop, but they don't want to end the relationship. And we have to always remember that when we're talking about restraining orders and things such as that, we have to be aware that African-American older adults may have other priorities that take precedence over the abuse that they're presented with. They may have housing, health, mental health concerns, or other things. And mainstream programming may just be only focusing on the victimization, and need to know that if these things are in place, then the other things cannot be in place. And then centering around the criminal justice system, we know the history of setting up programs for victims has had this partnership with the criminal justice systems. And we know that because of mistrust, there may be concerns with having mainstream industry dealing with the mainstream system. And many of these services for older adults are anchored in these partnerships of law enforcement. And that's when there's going to be concern, right? So we just need to make sure, and these prosecutorial agencies that are coming, that we deal with every day as those who provide services, okay? So what other practices have you seen? And what resonates with you based on your experience from the things that I've just discussed? It's just something to ponder over, these mainstream practices that we've done and we continue to do, and understanding that trust comes from history. I'm going to pass it on to Victoria.
Thank you so much, Dr. Buck, and thanks so much for the way in which you have just really thoroughly explained everything. And so let me make sure that you all can see me. Okay. So let's now talk a little bit more about what makes culturally specific programs and organizations unique. Dr. Buck has already really started this conversation some, but we're going to go a bit deeper and just learn more about these important programs. Again, programs that are designed for, designed by, and that are led by the communities that they intend to serve. So in this case, by African-American leaders. So there are 6 elements of African-American culture-specific programs that we'll do a bit of a deep dive into. First, they are community-driven, in that the community is community-led. So it's the issues of the community, it's the experiences of the community, it's the people of the community that are intentional about creating these unique programs and spaces. Being racially and culturally literate, the understanding of the racial and cultural experience of African Americans, being culturally grounded as well, and peer support, such a great concept that we'll talk a bit more about. And again, that holistic view of well-being, really addressing and treating and servicing an entire family when there are incidences of violence is often the approach with these organizations. And the community-based and versus criminal justice-based, and how important and central the community-based approach is in working with the African American community. So we go to the next slide. So either community-led or community-driven, it's the voice of those who are served in that community that's front and center. So it's not designed to exclude anyone, but these programs are designed to be radically focused on the African American population and community and those unique needs. So these, programs are often grounded in the belief that those closest to the issue can solve the issue or can solve the problem, and they know the solutions. And so it's the leadership, these organizations seek and are again led by leadership from that community and take place and have many oftentimes create unique spaces and places for members of the communities to come and to talk and to converse freely. And the conversation piece that is always known to be very free flowing, very inclusive. A space where as African Americans, we can come in, let our hair down and know that we are feeling safe in a culturally specific organization. So that's what we mean when we say that it's community driven. You'll see here that there is a quote by LaTanya Maley, who is a director of the Affinity Community Services in Chicago. And it says, we've always existed and found solutions to problems in our community, and we need to amplify those culturally appropriate solutions that are based in our pleasure, wellness, care, and families, and ask that institutions of power and funding get on board with what the community says we need and what we say works. So that really speaking to, we are the experts, the African American leaders are the experts in what African Americans need, and trusting the voices and the leadership of African American leaders in culturally specific organizations is one of the major steps in improving services and improving the livelihood of African American victims of violence, and of course, in particular, of older adults. You can go to the next slide. So racially and culturally literate, as Dr. Buck said, these programs and organizations understand this important historical and cultural context that was broken down earlier, how it impacts, how it shows up in families, how it really how it takes a toll in families, how it weathers people, but also the resilience that the Black community and African Americans have, although these experiences have happened and continue to happen. So another powerful quote, and I want to read these quotes because they are just that powerful, from Antonia Norton, who's a director of the Asha Project that we've partnered with here, that says, we knew even back then that Black women didn't like going to mainstream programs, didn't like telling their story to white women who were looking at them like they're crazy. They placed judgment on them, treated them like they didn't matter. This has always been an issue. So being intentional, and she says this point, Miss Norton says this point, in a way to make sure that as mainstream organizations and culture and elder justice teams are just aware of how they can show up in service provision, and being conscious that if you hear a story or an experience that may be different from your own, how important it is to have the cultural literacy, to have just the thought process to come with a trauma-informed lens in service provision and in caring for African American survivors. Next slide, please. So culturally grounded, culture cured and history healed. Everything has a cultural nuance. And so this quote was by Executive Director Kalima Johnson of the Sasha Center in Detroit, Michigan. And this piece speaks to being culturally grounded, the service practice and interventions that are focused on the culture and on the community, on the African American community. For example, food and home cooked soul food and meals is a very important piece, and we'll talk about that too in just a moment. The faith community and faith traditions, obviously maintaining the history and lived experiences of African Americans in this country. We know now that there are efforts to block and to prevent the teaching of African history and African American history in this country, and to talk about slavery, and to talk about Jim Crow laws, and to talk about these experiences that African Americans have had for of over 400 years in the North American continent. And so that means that being culturally grounded and being unapologetic and intentional about that is urgent and incredibly important, because, you know, when that happens as an older adult, as we saw a picture of Ruby Bridges, and we saw her lived experience as a little girl and now as an older adult. Just to think about what it may feel like for her to have maybe her story can't be told or shared in schools anymore because of policies that are in place to stop her story from being shared, or to say that it's problematic to talk about that history. So being culturally grounded, to share and to amplify the voices and experiences and create the spaces of safety for African American adults is a huge focus in these culturally specific programs. Next slide, please. So peer support. We are not collectively healing together. It's not us and them, it's we, also by Kalima Johnson. And in this case, and in many cases, it's those with the lived experiences that are those who are providing support and services. And they also are oftentimes the leaders in the program, are intentional that the healing of the individual survivors or a family is tied up and is a part of the healing of the whole community. That when one person in the community is, in the spirit of Ubuntu, if one person is not not whole, then we truly all are not whole. And so Ubuntu means I am because we are. So, you know, I can only be here because of all of us together and because of our collective experience. So when one person is hurting or one person is harmful, we all are. So the concept of peer support is a critical foundation in essentially stating that we are the work, you know, that the work that culturally specific organizations do to provide healing services or support for the African American community is also in part for the leaders and those who are working there themselves. Next slide, please. So the holistic view of well-being. Again, this speaks to really treating the whole person. I mean, the whole, even sometimes the whole family. The concept of not wanting loved ones to be to have to come in contact with the criminal justice system, or to go to jail, or to possibly lose their job. As you know, we know that mass incarceration has so deeply impacted the African American community, has ripped families apart, just changed lives through generations. Due to mass incarceration practices. And so this concept speaks directly to that, in that we really want to heal the entire family, and not just have a focus on just one person. Or, you know, you have to, you know, there can be practices of having to have certain, you know, just oftentimes in mainstream practices, there's this focus in really wanting to get that person to leave maybe their situation, and true danger can be there, but making sure that we're listening to and valuing the experiences and the desires of that person who has experienced violence. And so I want to read this quote by Dr. Patricia Davenport, which says, "What is missing in mainstream is the lack of holistic approaches to healing. For me, it is important to not just work with the survivor, but also the children, extended family members, and the offenders. All individuals need services in order to break the cycle of violence." Right? So we all have to work together. We all have been touched by this, whether it be directly or indirectly. And it is critical that that healing approaches are seen in a much holistic way. And that is such a center point in culturally specific programs and organizations. And community-based versus criminal justice-based. Therese really laid this out so beautifully. I do want to read this quote. "We need to spend more time creating solutions that don't involve the state into the Black home that often hasn't been a place of support and care." So the creativity piece here of, you know, thinking how else can, you know, as a mainstream partner or a mainstream organization or a mainstream elder justice team, what other solutions, you know, can we seek to bring about? Can we share? Can we offer to, you know, in our community? Things outside of court programs or court-based programs, and even on, you know, even on community coordination teams. Sometimes even, you know, the presence of law enforcement and the presence of prosecutors or judges, you know, may make one not feel not feel safe from a culturally specific program or leader to come and to share, or maybe so, of course, but it's a different dynamic when you know that your experiences or your those that you serve oftentimes aren't comfortable in those spaces. So thinking and creating, I really want to focus on that piece, creating more solutions, thinking of additional solutions that don't involve the state in particular and working with the African American community. Next slide. And so for part 2 of this, I just want to mention and discuss quickly the extension of what's seen as the system, or criminal or social services being seen as an extension of the criminal justice or criminal legal system, due to practices that have been marginalizing, that as we shared earlier, due to experiences that haven't been healing or welcoming for African Americans. That's what's often seen, that sometimes mainstream partners or organizations are not seen, or there's oftentimes can think that this isn't a safe space for me because they work so closely with the court system or they work so closely with the police, and so really having to just be conscious of that as mainstream providers, that with culturally specific organizations, this piece of making sure that this piece of this awareness of mainstream practices sometimes not feeling as safe as a culturally specific one can often be due to this thought and to the experiences that African Americans have had. And so this quote by Maria Santiago says, "The people I work with often won't call the police. So how do we create safety plans that work for you?" So thinking about that piece, how do we create something that's different? And that's what culturally specific organizations have done, and that's what they're doing, creating something that's different, something that is most relevant and germane to the African American community. And now, we're here to make sure that more of you as mainstream providers and mainstream service providers and community coordination teams and task forces and CCR teams are aware of how valuable and critical it is for you to partner with these culturally specific organizations. At times doing things differently or seeing things differently, if you don't know or don't understand why an organization kind of has that approach, maybe mainstream organizations may be more reticent or hesitant to reach out and to engage, but this is why we're having this webinar and this conversation, and why these resources have been created to bridge these gaps, because the African American community also needs us and needs the partnerships that can only strengthen support services that are provided. So next slide, please. So I want to share some examples of culturally specific programs. In this project, we had the opportunity to learn about so many amazing programs and what they offer, and just what makes them unique and how they've been doing things. And so I just want to highlight a couple here, but know that there are so many ways that culturally specific organizations across the country are doing really unique work that is making a tremendous impact. So first, I wanted to highlight Affinity Community Services in Chicago, where LaTanya Maley is the executive director. And a couple of things that they are doing that's on the regular is holding community gatherings with younger and older adults. So to deepen understanding amongst generations and to address harm that may have occurred between these groups. And so that is, we know that with older adults and younger adults, there's new phrases, there's differences in how you do things, there's different norms. And so now, so Affinity has created a space to talk these things through. So that there's better understanding and unity amongst older and younger adults. And so to hear more about that experience was really cool and really unique. And then secondly, Affinity also hosts peer-led groups to reach diverse identities in their community. And so one in particular is the Trailblazer 60+ peer group that centers the experiences of LGBTQ plus women of color. So really being intentional about having that space for older adults. And I neglected to mention that Affinity serves the African American LGBTQ plus community in Chicago. All right, you can go to the next slide. Next is the Sasha Center in Detroit. And so the Sasha Center focuses on providing healing services and supports to African-American survivors of sexual assault. And so Sasha explores the resiliency of Black people through the use of art, culture, dance, and language. They have amazing poetry groups, a writing workshop for supporters and survivors, a survivors healing retreat to address how culture can cure and history heals. So you heard that quote earlier by Kalima Johnson. And then also unique programming in Thoughts of a Black Man series. So it's a conversation series with Black men leaders uplifting healthy relationships and providing resources to men. So just a few examples there of some of the programming that's happening at some organizations. I wanted to highlight this piece to the importance of food and culture specific programming. Amongst all the leaders that we spoke with, we always heard this theme of how important it is to have comfort, nourishing meals in your times when you connect with survivors. Many of the leaders that we spoke with just talk about just how you got to meet this need first. Before you can have a conversation about what's going on in someone's household or violence they've experienced. A warm meal can go a long way in helping survivors to feel safe, to be able to share and to open up, and to meet the immediate need of someone in crisis. And so when meals are served and served with love, they can establish trust and the opportunity to build relationships. So that often is not the case with mainstream organizations, but with culturally specific ones, having the food and a meal there is so important. So we wanted to mention that too. That is another unique part. Okay, so some of the challenges that are faced, and so this will be my last slide before our final discussion. Culturally specific organizations do a lot of great work, as you can see, but oftentimes we got feedback that many are misunderstood by their mainstream counterparts, just not having really full awareness of why they're doing what they're doing. Oftentimes these organizations lack funding and the support that mainstream organizations have. They're not as well known. Oftentimes have a smaller staff, don't have the capacity to even get larger grants and things of that nature. Often tokenized on community coordination teams. So there may be an existing community coordination team or CCR team or task force, and then everyone's assembled and we've been working on projects, and now we're going to invite this organization to come. And so that can often there can often be that feeling of tokenization that I'm only invited here to check a box. And so that's another challenge that culturally specific organizations face. Not included in initiatives to seek funding as a partner. So kind of, again, piggybacking off that tokenization piece. We heard stories of how there would be an organization, a mainstream organization would apply for a grant or maybe even receive that, and then afterwards, or maybe have already written it, and then once they're pretty much done, ask a culturally specific organization, oh, would you like to join, or you could do this piece once the plan has pretty much been thought out. So not really including someone as a partner, but more so as, to make sure that you check the diversity box. Culturally specific organizations often face the lack of public support surrounding racial justice. So when there is an issue that is in high public attention, like the killing of George Floyd or something of that nature, and a mainstream organization is silent, that speaks volumes to the African American community. And so that's a huge challenge that culturally specific organizations face. And then one of the final ones here, of course, there are many others, is law enforcement not having demonstrated consistent respect for the African American community. All right, so I will turn things now back over to Latrice to lead us, but the three of us will be here for the discussion, a couple of discussion questions that we have.
Okay, everyone. You got a lot of information, great information, and things that we thought about as we were going on. Great discussion in the chat, as well as those that responded earlier when we were having a group discussion. So we like to ask, what aspect of today's webinar are resonating with you? And did you learn anything new today? You can put it in the chat. You can raise your hand so you can unmute yourself. Kristen? Okay. Again, so what aspect of today's seminar are resonating with you? And did you learn anything new? I like the resource provided so I can continue to educate myself. Thank you, Julie.
Awesome. No, I think as we're kind of waiting for people to respond, that just the thing that I love about talking about culturally specific programs is how powerful the programming is, and that it is a distinction and it's different from the traditional ones that are mostly well known in the service provision space. So to be able to highlight some of the unique things is really special. I see we've got the chat getting busy now.
Hey,
So Laura said the challenge of what we can provide outside the traditional services or criminal justice has resonated with me, not skirting that either, but thinking about what success means for someone. What is the outcome that they want? I will find out about how my legal services can connect with some of the programs mentioned. Maureen said the disconnect between traditional and community-based organizations. So lots of great points.
yes. And remembering that, a lot of times when we're having these discussions, we're like, I do good work. No one is saying that you don't,
Right.
We're saying is that if you have a culturally specific program in your community, trying to figure out where those programs are, how can you connect with them? How can they come to the table? Sometimes community-based organizations, as stated when we were doing most of the interviews, it's like they've been in tables and they really didn't feel like their voice was heard, or they didn't know where the tables were. Or even when they were trying to connect with individuals, they were like, what is it that they were doing different? And I think it's so significant with everything that we said today is understanding the significance of culturally specific and responsive programs, right? Within your communities and how they can be of help, how you can collaborate and partner in a way that helps older African Americans receive holistic services.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
There's more coming in the chat even now.
Okay.
About the ways that mainstream services fall short.
Yeah, the funding aspect, that is real. Many times they're not. And if they're funding on these like subcontracts and things such as that. And even if they're being funded in collaboration with mainstream organizations, as Victoria stated earlier, a lot of times the script has already been designed. The grant has already been written. And then they come in with these MOUs, we call them, not real partnerships, this memorandum of understanding, a signature page, basically, and it's not inclusive of the things that are relevant for culturally specific agencies within those communities, and understanding, many times they're doing a lot of fundraising. Many of these executive directors started these agencies out of their own pocket with their families and their faith communities backing them in these situations, and then later being able to engage, not always having the physical agents to be able to monitor certain things, and some of the check boxes they don't have, maybe not an HR system in place, and many of the things that larger organizations have around the individuals that are grant writers and things such as that. Those EDs are doing the grant writing, they're doing the fundraising, they're doing the community building, sometimes they're doing the programming, all in an effort to maintain services.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on. So are you aware of any culturally specific organizations in your community? And if so, do you have a relationship with them? So if you know they exist, do you have a relationship? Is there a history there? I'm always say in the work that we do in victim services, sometimes there's a long history. It may not be the best history, but with new partners and new players, sometimes we need to extend and go out, see what they're doing. We always say it's good if there's events that culturally specific agencies are having, see what they're doing. If they're having a fundraiser, if they're having a community event, or even inviting them to the things that you're having, reaching out to who these executive directors are and partners are within your community. So how have you engaged? Are you aware of these agencies in your community? And do you have a relationship with them? And what type of relationship do you have? And even do you know? Because sometimes these things don't have anything to do with you. They have to do with past relationships that most new EDs and advocates have no understanding of, that may have happened 30 years ago, but trying to change some of those patterns of how things were to how they can be. So, you know, when we talk about it, as I stated, giving recommendations of just how to go and engage, you know, doing some research on the internet to what community-based organizations are in your community and what can you do, inviting them to your team meetings, your CSTs, your MSTs, or however you identify the agencies within your community. And if you're unaware, asking maybe some of your partners, because sometimes these community-based organizations may not have a website, you know, they may only be well known in their communities. And so maybe some of your partners have a relationship with individuals providing these services to older African Americans within your community, and really being diligent about seeking to understand and know who they are, building a relationship, and really listening, understanding, valuing, and respecting what it is that they bring to the table. So research, ask, and invite.
I also just wanted to add to that, just to remember that oftentimes culturally specific organizations may not be, they may not identify as a victim services organization, or they may not identify as a domestic violence or sexual assault agency in particular, because they often do serve and provide comprehensive services. So they may be a mental health provider or a substance abuse provider, or provide family services or services for children, but also do provide, you know, victim services amongst their array of services. So that's something important to just keep in mind as well. You may think that, oh, I had no idea that agency actually, you know, didn't think of them as one we could partner with, because they're not, you know, they don't identify as a victim services agency. So that's something just to keep in mind too.
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize that point, because within this project, actually, we initially were really set out to talk to African-American elder abuse programs. And we found, well, there really aren't very many, or we couldn't find them. And so we were really had to think beyond the typical elder justice or victim services partners, and thinking, oh, well, the, you know, health equity program that's maybe focused on African-American, the African-American community is serving older adults, even if that's not their primary population, or the housing program, or the family services, or the counseling program that's culturally specific. So that was one of the main things that I learned early on, is really thinking beyond the typical partners, because if you're really thinking about the overlap of, you know, African-American and just elder abuse or just victim services, there really might not be a huge overlap.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Kristen. And thank you, Latrice, as well. We can go to, as we're coming towards the end of our time, we do have a little homework for you based on our questions, that if you don't know of or have a relationship with a culturally specific organization in your community, please take some time to research and identify one, share that with your organization, with your staff or team members. Also look for some on the national level as well. So the UGMA Incorporated is one that you know, that we're familiar with, and that works on a national level and provides services specifically for the African-American community. Once you identify an organization, take the time to learn a bit more about their programming, their initiatives, their events and services provided, especially if there's some in your community or in your city. That's an important point that we'll talk to and deep dive into next week. And then finally, love for you to read and review the Collaborating for Justice report. We can put that link in the chat again, and then on the next slide, we have a QR code for you to quickly access the Collaborating for Justice guide. It has been emailed to you as well, but go ahead and, you know, and scan that too, if that's easier for you. And also you will, we'll make sure, you know, we'll have the PowerPoint. We can send it to you again. So don't worry if you miss anything, and don't worry about that. The next slide will then show the QR code for the Increasing Access Toolkit. So we want you to take a look at that as well. But of course, for this webinar series, we're laser focused on the Collaborating for Justice guide. And then next, So excited. We have 2 additional webinars, so we're not done yet. We're really just getting started. So next week, we're going to talk about the guiding principles of equitable partnerships and collaboration. So all the things that were uncovered in our projects, and the strategies that we found that would be the most practical and relevant and important in building these equitable partnerships. We're going to share them with you and do a deep dive into those. And then also talk more about the conversation guide and the community forum toolkit. So we'll dig a bit deeper into that. And then finally, on Tuesday, April 16th, so we'll have a few weeks in between between the second and third webinar, we will have a conversation with some of the culturally specific organization leaders that we mentioned and quoted here today. I know for sure one is here on the webinar. And so we wanted to make sure we had a time and space for you all to hear directly from them in their own words of what this experience has been like, what equitable partnerships will look like. And so really excited about that conversation. And those that will join us will be Ms. Antonia Norton of the Asha Project and Dr. Patricia Davenport of Our House Incorporated and Kalima Johnson of the Sasha Center in Detroit. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then one of our last slide, we just have a slide. Next slide is just staying connected to NCall. In the meantime, you can sign up for our newsletter, and we also see our socials and everything there. We have a lot of resources on abuse and later life there that you can access. And we have an evaluation, a brief evaluation we'd really like you to fill out before you leave. Kristen just put it in the chat, so please take a moment to fill that out. We really want to get your feedback. We thank you for what you've said thus far. And if there's any, we're almost at time, but any final questions, comments as we close? We're saying thank you. So if you have any, any questions in between now and the next webinar, please feel free to, send us an email. On the next slide, you'll see our emails. And the one after that, sorry, you'll see our email addresses. So if you need to contact Dr. Buck, Kristen, or myself, please do so. We look forward to talking with you, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Dr. Buck or Kristen, any final comments?
No, just thank you all for joining. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you. Make sure you come back next week and the week after. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.